Emma Brown, welcome to Freedom Over Fascism.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
We're talking this season about what we as a pro-democracy movement writ large are for, as
Yep.
opposed to what we're against. We all know what we're against.
Mhm.
Um, and we're thinking about imagining a new America after this moment and after fascism falls, because
Yeah,
eventually
it
it
will.
will. So I wanted to ask you um, about what you think the future looks like. Either how do we get there,
Hmm.
or once this moment is over, how do we imagine a different kind of future than what we've got now?
Yeah. Well, I love that question, and I have plenty to say about it. But first, just thank you for having me. This is a very interesting topic, a very cool podcast that you have in Substack. So we're really excited to have been included and be able to talk to you about this. And so I'm the executive director of Giffords, organization founded by Gabby Giffords. You can see her behind me here, the poster of her. Um, and she is somebody who has an endless well of courage and grit and fortitude, and is a big part, I think, of how we are approaching this moment and thinking about what she has survived and how we come through it. So, um, when we think about the future, do you think about this future on guns and on this topic, or you're thinking more globally for our democracy, or both? Both. Okay. Okay. So.
Because in one way, the present is a choice,
Mhm.
right? Because we all know what the answer to gun violence is.
Yeah, we're living it.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, we can talk about all the details or how we're going to discuss it, but I live in Massachusetts and
Yeah.
our gun death rate is a whole lot lower than
That's right.
other places. So, yeah, start wherever you think it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think that you know, part of the thing that is like, I think, threatening our democracy and really rotting our democracy is the same thing that is at the core of why our country's gun violence epidemic is as bad as it is. And that is the grip of corporate interests, ultimately. So when people are thinking about guns in America, they don't often think about corporate interests. What they think about is the NRA. And the NRA is a worthwhile thing to consider, right? It has been responsible for a tremendous, amount of pain and suffering across the country. I think, for listeners who might remember an NRA from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, like it has really transformed. It is not our parents, grandparents' NRA anymore. It is a far right political organization. And so, I think for the first 10 years or so that the gun violence prevention movement really was doing its work, the NRA was the thing that everybody focused on. But the NRA at the end of the day is a shell company, right? It is a pass through for really large corporate entities that are making money off of selling as many guns as they possibly can to Americans. That's how we ended up with 300 million Americans and 400 million guns in circulation. And so when we're thinking about this problem, you actually have to take a step back. And I think when you're thinking about fascism and our democracy, you have to take a step back and look at the cycles of it, right? So when we're thinking about gun violence in the United States, if you're zooming out on the last 25 years, one thing I always want to sort of point people to is this moment in time that is sort of under discussed and under understood, which is in 2005, there was a law that was passed, and you may be familiar with this, Stephanie. There was a law that was passed that gave the gun industry unprecedented federal immunity from civil liability. And that sounds complicated, but essentially what it was is that in the 90s, we were starting to see the first major mass shootings. We saw Columbine, we saw a handful of other shootings. So there started being pressure on the gun industry to change its practices, right? Adopt basic consumer safety practices. To stop these from happening. And instead of doing that, they mounted a very successful lobbying campaign and they won this bill in 2005 that gave them immunity. And if you're looking at gun violence in the United States since 2005, it has gone like this, right? It has
mhm.
really dramatically expanded to the point that it is now the leading cause of death for children in the United States, right? And that's something that I think a lot of folks look at and they're like, "Oh my God, how did we get here?" And we got here because our country began prioritizing corporate interests, and CEOs and billionaires over the lives of Americans. And when we're thinking about how our democracy arrived at this point, I would also point to, the billionaires and the corporate interests that have rigged the game. And, Donald Trump, I have few kind things to say about him. One thing I think he really understood, though, was how to talk to people about that. Paradoxically, despite accelerating a lot of that work himself, he knows how to talk to people about a rigged system.
Hmm.
And there's like some weird parallels between him and like the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party and how they talk about the rigged system, And I think that this country feels intrinsically that the systems are rigged. And when we're thinking about guns, the system is rigged, right? It is rigged to prioritize corporate players over lives. And, when I think about that immunity statute, again, it sounds sort of granular and wonky, but if you think about the parallels, imagine that there was a car that was spinning off of the road and killing everybody in the car, every time. And if that happened, we wouldn't be like obsessed with the driver and what the circumstances were around the driver. We would be like, what's the problem with the car? If there was a furniture, manufacturer that was making dressers that were tipping over and crushing toddlers, you would sue the manufacturer and you'd latch the dresser to the wall. And instead, what has happened for us is we have been unable to constrain this industry and put basic safety safeguards around it, which has resulted in weapons being sold to more and more people in a more extreme way and a more dangerous way. And that's sort of how we ended up where we are.
All right. So we're back to uh, billionaires rigging the game.
Yeah.
Let's like pull it out, just take a step back from the word corporate interests because that can get bland. And one of
Mm,
the things that we're trying to do here is like, how do we reach people? Because we're going to need to reach people in their emotions and not necessarily policy wise or Democrats like or pro-democracy people like to make really good factual points,
that's right.
but really people need to, like, feel it in their gut.
Mhm.
So, this is the oligarchy, this is
Yes.
the billionaires, this is, people who want to make a lot of money at the expense of, uh, people's lives, kids' lives.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, just wanna put a stake in that.
Right. And when you ask about like the future, what does the future look like when we have changed our current conditions? I think like that calculation is reversed, right? We care less about the billionaires, we care less about the oligarchy, and we care more about regular people. And I think currently the Democratic Party is really searching for that message because that is what the Democratic Party ultimately is about. It's about regular people, but we've like lost the thread, with folks in a lot of different parts of the country, and so I think we're looking to really get that back. And I want to come back and keep talking about your question about the future and what does it look like to have a future that is different. And I think it really starts with the toppling of the CEO over a regular person, right? A CEO over, the life of like the 10-year-old who dies, in a church in the first day of, school, right? Like that is what it looks like, I think, for this issue to fundamentally change.
So, the how do we get there is a very large question. So,
Is there a
let's
question though?
I mean that's the question we're all asking. But can you fill in for me uh, what you think that future where the everyday person is prioritized over the billionaire, w can you flesh that out for me? What would that society look like?
Mhm. Well, I think on the issue of gun violence, you live in Massachusetts. I think that society doesn't look like every state is Massachusetts, right? Like it's a very singular place. I would sort of like back out to the fact that, Giffords was founded by gun owners, by red state Democrats, people from Arizona who understand, a tradition of firearm ownership. And we are really not after a world, a future where there are no guns, right? Like that's sort of what the gun right likes to say that we're after. And the reality is that we are after a future where dangerous people who pose an imminent threat to themselves and others aren't able to access, a weapon that was designed for the US military, right? Like that is the future that we are looking for. And when you said this, before we started recording, if you're looking at just like the gun death rates across the country, Massachusetts has one of the lowest death rates because it has some of the strongest laws. And I think our future on this issue, when we get there, looks like that being the case, in Louisiana, in Texas, in Wyoming, in Idaho, that all have, again, traditions of gun ownership. There's nothing wrong with owning guns. What is wrong is ultimately when the gun manufacturer is able to sell whatever kind of gun to whoever will pay for it, right, at the expense of safety for communities and for families everywhere. And so, I think one of the hardest and like most heartbreaking parts of this problem is I think something that sort of has to shift before we get to that future, which is, we see shootings like the shooting that we saw in Minneapolis a couple of weeks ago, school shooting where two students were shot and killed during the opening mass, of their first week of school. They died literally praying in pews, and there were over a dozen other kids who were injured, and countless others who saw it all happen, whose lives will never be the same. And after that happened, these parents got on national television and they're just distraught, right? Like they're distraught and they are pleading with the country to do something differently to keep this from ever happening again. And we've seen those parents, we've seen them over and over again. And ultimately, they've cracked through and been able to generate. I think this is really important to just acknowledge. They have been able to generate significant state and federal change, but it hasn't been a tidal wave of change. And when you see these parents, you think like, God, the level of grief that they are experiencing and they are communicating has to change everything, right? How could it not change everything? And it hasn't yet, and it hasn't because of the way that our system is built. Again, prioritize the CEO and the person who is making a bunch of money off of these gun sales over the parent that has just lost a child, right? And so I do think that is why we will have to shift towards those parents, right, and away from those corporations. And I think that in a future where we have gotten through this, and we're on the other side. And I do think it's really important for people to remember, like, this wasn't the case 30 years ago, right? This is not like, the gun right likes to sort of say, this is the price that you pay for the Second Amendment, like bullshit, right? This wasn't the case 50 years ago. It wasn't the case 30 years ago. The modern American lifetime, for an adult has held years where we didn't see this kind of violence. And so I just think that we have to start with the fact that you absolutely must refuse to accept that this is just what it is, And I think that our biggest challenge on this issue is people sort of getting stuck there where they're like, this happens all the time. Nothing changes. This is just what it is. This is just what it is to be in this country. And I think that that is what they want, right? Like they want us to be held in this place of immobility and this place of sadness and cynicism. And in reality, what we need is anger and movement and optimism. At the end of the day, is one of the most powerful things that we can have. I think when we're thinking about this issue, and also when we're thinking about the future of the democracy, is optimism.
So, how do you think we find that optimism? I mean, we've talked here a bunch about how hope is a series of actions. It's not a
Hmm.
state of mind. Um, and I'd like to drill down on where you think that optimism might come from. How do we get it? How do we get past the paralysis
Yeah.
that the regime obviously and the billionaires obviously want us to feel?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I think when you were looking for that, the first place to look is at the local and at the state level, where there is tremendous work being done on some of the hardest issues that we face, across the board. And, I think about, so taking a, step back on this issue, people would often say to me when I started this job, like, God, that is so hard to work on. That issue has just got to be like debilitatingly hard to work on. And it is true that there's a lot of loss, attached to working on this issue. And it is true that I have never felt more hope and never felt more optimism than I do the closer I get to it. And I think that's partially because if you're looking at this, Gabby, again behind me, founded, she founded Giffords 12 years ago. And in that period of time, we've been able to pass over 700 laws at the state level. 700 laws at the state level furthering gun safety. And I want to just talk about what that means because I think that that's a big number that sometimes like people are like unsure of how to process that. Um, California was one of the first states in the country to adopt a red flag law. A red flag law helps us keep guns out of the hands of somebody who's an imminent danger to themselves or others. Basically lets their family, or neighbors petition the court for like temporary separation from that person and from their firearms. So California was one of the first states in the country to adopt that law. UC Davis did a study that found that in the first 3 years of its implementation, it had stopped 54 mass shootings in the state of California alone in a 3-year period of time. And when we're thinking about the impact of these laws and the lives that they have saved, that was one law in one state over a couple of years, and we have passed 700 of them, right? So that is a lot of people who didn't die, right? That's a lot of kids who went home from school. That's a lot of parents who didn't experience, the worst day of their lives. So I think that globally, when you're thinking about this issue, we are actually having a tremendous amount of success, which people don't know, for the same reason that they feel sort of hopeless, which is that the culture doesn't incentivize good news right now. That's just a fact. And then I think the other thing is even this year, um, we are looking at people who are doing incredibly difficult work in the hardest contexts that you can imagine, and they are succeeding. So, Alabama, the state of Alabama, passed a gun bill earlier this year. People are shocked every time I say that, just shocked. Alabama passed a machine gun conversion device bill through a Republican trifecta. Right. That happened because there was a terrible shooting in Birmingham late last year. And the Republicans in the legislature were like, we have to do something. Right. There was a moment that was available to Alabama, and Alabama took, that step forward. And that was amazing. Right. We also passed community violence intervention funding in Texas for the first time this year, which is going to save a lot of people. And it is a modest amount of funding, but it's the first step forward that Texas has taken from a legislative standpoint on our issue in recent history. In Maine, we passed several pieces of legislation over the last 18 months after the Lewiston shooting in late 2023. So, I derive a lot of hope and a lot of optimism by realizing that in these red states, these bright red places where people are like, particularly in blue cities and states, not to take a shot at Massachusetts, but like, people will often be like, why are we even spending our time there? Like those people, are lost. Like there's no way we should like separate from them. And
Mhm.
I have seen the most amazing work happening in these bright red states where people have very long odds and they just refuse to quit. Right. And then they refuse to quit and they keep going and they keep going. And then one day something is possible that wasn't possible the day before. And I think that ultimately that belief that that window will open is really at the core of our work.
Mhm.
I think it is a thing of tremendous hope and optimism. And, the other thing is that that work, that opening of the window is often fueled by people who have lost everything, right? They have lost their kids, they've lost their spouses to this violence, and they're doing all of this work to prevent it from happening to somebody else, which is, a really incredible act of service that requires a lot from them. So those are the things that I think, really fuel me.
Well, I'm glad that you talked about those because I didn't know uh, about those things,
Yeah,
and I'm generally fairly um, clicked in.
yeah,
Um, and there's a larger conversation there about blue states and investment in red states. And, that's one of the big conversations I want to have this season. Um, so I'm kind of wanting to put a pin in that
yeah,
for our listeners that we'll keep talking about that and why it's important not to give up on the red states. What I want to ask you now is about the culture. So gun violence is a combination of somebody who uh, wants to commit violence and the availability of guns. What is it about where we are as a society right now that makes people want to commit the gun violence? Is it white supremacy? Is it, uh, feeling alienated? What is it that's driving this violence that we keep seeing over and over?
Yeah, well, you just put your finger on it, which is, and we have this conversation a lot around the topic of political violence, right? Because there's this sort of rush to rhetoric. Like people always talk about like it's the rhetoric. It's the rhetoric on the right, it's the rhetoric on the left. And, the rhetoric is a part of it. And, the polarization, which, I would probably say is, I think, at the core of it, is a part of it. But the thing that makes those moments deadly is the fact that somebody has a gun, right? We think back to last summer when we saw multiple, attempts on President Trump's life. And, you know, he was on a golf course and somebody with an AK-47 was hiding in the bushes, right? And at the time, everyone was like, it's the Democratic campaign. They've got to tone it down. These like comments about authoritarianism. And I was like, there is a guy with an AK-47 in the bushes. Like that is what, resulted in the attempt on President Trump's life. It is not, that we were talking about tyranny, right? So, we really focus on the access part, the fact that somebody with violent intent is easily able to access a gun no matter where they are in this country because of our very loose federal laws. So that is where the majority of our work lies, is how do we keep that moment of violence from becoming deadly? And this extends to um, certainly, high profile moments of violence like that, but it also extends to domestic violence, where we know somebody who is armed in a moment of domestic violence is 5 times more likely to kill their partner, right? And we also understand that in a suicide context, in a mental health context, if somebody has a gun, they are far more likely to die. And if we're able to separate them from their gun in that moment, it is very unlikely that they reattempt, with a gun. We've likely saved their life altogether. So again, that's sort of that intersection is where we operate. But your question was about like how do we get to that point? Like what is actually driving the violence? And I do think white supremacy is a big part of it, right? I think that the gun industry itself has actually had a major role in stoking white supremacy and stoking extremism. If you look at any of their advertisements, it is no surprise that the Venn diagram of people who were at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, and the people who are being sold to at huge levels by the gun industry is a very strong overlap, right? They are fueling right wing extremism and they're fueling white supremacy and white supremacist violence and armed extremism. And if you're looking at sort of the relationship between armed extremism and countries that are sliding from a democratic model to a liberal model, there's a real relationship there, and the gun industry knows that, right? And that is why we think their marketing um, attempts are really really problematic. I think that the other thing is that we understand that we are at a moment of really heightened polarization where fewer people are reaching across ideological divides. Fewer people are marrying, other people who don't agree with them and don't vote the same way that they do. Um, Fewer people are building community and friendships and relationships, with folks who have different ideological backgrounds. And so I really would say that I think one of the core drivers of violence in the US, in addition to technological advancements and isolationism and loneliness, which is a part of it, is political polarization, and even in my own lifetime and my own career, we have seen it get worse and worse. And, you know, um, part of how we think about that in this organization is, as I said, Gabby and Senator Mark Kelly, co-founders of Giffords, red state Democrats. They are folks who structurally, had to work with people who are really different than them, who believe different things than they do. And so, our organization really looks to cultivate what we sometimes refer to as the unlikely ally, the person who might really be helpful on this issue, but isn't often called upon by, traditionally democratically aligned issues or organizations. And that will sometimes put us, in conversations with people that we really don't agree with, on most things. But perhaps we can find a little bit of common ground, on something that we can work on together. And we organize gun owners at Giffords. There's a Giffords Gun Owners for Safety program where we're offering, gun owners in the U.S. an alternative to the NRA. A place where they can celebrate, their sort of tradition of hunting, their tradition of gun ownership, while also advocating for basic safety reforms that keep people moving forward. And what that will mean, and I've spent a good amount of time with those folks. What that'll mean is that we're in rooms with people that we don't see eye to eye on about everything, right? Like an assault weapons ban, for example. But we're able to work together and find common ground and focus on that. And I do think that those spaces are rarer now than they ever have been. And that's part of the reason that our theory of change requires that bridge building, and that reaching across ideological divides, because I do think that is, a driver of violence.
So let's like go a little bit deeper on that theory of change. How not how did you come up with it, but what made you think that it would be successful? And then how did you implement it in a way that has uh, brought about change?
Yeah. Well, I think the reasons that we undertook it, were really about who founded the organization and what she expected, right? Gabby is somebody who expects us to go out and look for everybody that we could possibly persuade on this issue and have the hard conversations with them, right? Like she is certainly not content for us to like sit in our tent with our friends and not try with other people. I think the other thing about it is the fact that gun violence is pervading almost every part of American life, and it is touching communities, whether they are Republican communities or Democratic communities. The person with the gun who's in the moment of crisis doesn't really care who you voted for when they are shooting at you. And
Mhm,
the reality is that some of our best messengers on this subject, to when we're thinking about like the impediments to change are some of our very stubborn, Republicans at a federal level who just cannot bring themselves to vote for universal background checks, for example. Our best messengers, for those people are other Republicans, right? Or their law enforcement or their gun owners, or their veterans. They're people who have more traditional Republican constituencies and can engage in those conversations really effectively. And the reason we thought it would work is that we looked at the data, and 95% of the country supports um, universal background checks, right? Like 95%. Gabby will make a joke that the only thing more popular in America than universal background checks is free money and ice cream. Like whole, that's the whole thing, And um, I am a big fan of our reproductive freedom movement, and really good numbers for abortion access are in the low 80s, right? Which is, again, also almost everybody, but 95% is like literally everybody. And when you're looking under the hood at that number, that includes 92% of Trump voters support universal background checks. It includes 93% of gun owners. And so, we thought it would work, that theory of change, because this is such a broad spectrum popular issue, right, for folks, because gun owners in this country also have second graders, and their second graders are coming home from school and they're like, I learned to hide in a closet today, and the gun owner is like, oh my God. Right. And so,
mhm.
um, it has been very effective for us, particularly in these red state contexts, which is really where we specialize. We specialize in the red and the purple states, given our background. It's really been effective for us to find people who, again, probably don't see eye to eye with us on everything, but can go and have a hard conversation with a reticent legislator and flip a vote for us, who's coming from a different background and can bring sort of different expertise to that. And again, I think more globally, when we're in this moment where everything about our historical context and the political and the cultural moment like incentivizes people to go back into their camps, like we have to try as hard as we can to find other people and expand our own, and I think for us on this issue, that's supported by the data, and it's also supported by our own experience, that the best person to go and have the conversation with the Alabama legislator is going to be a gun owner, right? Or is going to be a Republican who can
Right.
say, I'm with you. I'm with you on almost everything. I really need you to think about this, and think about what we could do together if you were willing to be brave.
How did you convince gun owners that to join the organization and to, I would think that they probably had a lot of preconceived notions about what you do
Certainly.
and who you are. And how did you break through to them to be able to create the the gun organization, the gun safety organization, and to bring them into that tent?
Well, again, it's sort of like everything flows from the fact that Gabby is a gun owner. She'll always tell people that her congressional district, when she was in Congress, had Tombstone, Arizona in it. Tombstone is the location of the OK Corral shootout, right? And every day there are reenactments. So if you're driving, through Tombstone, you pass a sign that says the town too tough to die, and then you hear like the shots, of the reenactment of the OK Corral shootout, which is all to say that that is a big part of that is a part of the country that loves its guns, and loves its gun ownership. And so I think she brought a lot of credibility to that conversation with gun owners. And then, the way that our team is structured, is that our program is overseen, by gun owners who have personal experience. And then we lean really hard on, a group of ambassadors and senior ambassadors for us, who are part of the organization and have been working with us for a very long time and live all over the country, right? Montana and Texas and Virginia and all of these places. And they're able to help us recruit, other people, and they're able to help us bring other people in by saying, I know you think that this is a like gun control quote unquote organization that is all about stealing your guns. That's not what it is. It is about practicing responsible gun ownership and advocating for basic common sense solutions that are going to both protect the Second Amendment and keep people really safe. Um, I think just like any sort of successful organizing effort, it flows from being like legitimately grounded in the issue, having some credibility, which is where we start with Gabby, and then really trusting a small team of people that we've built out. I think it's 40 or so ambassadors that we have all over the country who are really the tip of the spear in helping us recruit people and bring them to regional trainings. We just did a training this past weekend in Dallas with a whole host of new gun owners. And the reality is too that after really high profile shootings, there are a lot of folks who are looking around and thinking like, what do I do? And m- many Americans own guns, and that is, a group of people who are interested in being part of this with us because again, there's no real like difference in public opinion between gun owners and non-gun owners. That's like a fiction that the NRA really effectively proliferated for a long time, was that like the pro-gun people believe X, the anti-gun people believe Y, and that's like those are two distinct groups. And again, if you're looking at the modern data, and this is public data, it's also Giffords data, you see that it's 90+% of gun owners who support the same reforms that non-gun owners support. Because again, like they are people who are living in this country and they are watching what is happening and they're sick of it, and they're interested in some basic accountability.
S- I'm interested in, I think, after I ask this question, we'll wrap up because I know you need to go. Um, Given the state of affairs, you've got a lot of people thinking that, civil war might be coming and they need to go out and buy a gun, who never would have thought such a thing and aren't trained
Mhm.
um, in its use. And what do you say to people who are new gun owners who've never even considered the idea, who buy them to protect their family, their house, whatever, without necessarily having the safety training and the gun use training that probably a lot of your organization has?
Yeah. Well, so I would say a few things. The first is that, with all respect to people who want to own guns and are interested in purchasing guns who don't already have them, I do think it's relevant to understand the science, which is that having a gun in your house does not actually make you safer. If you have a gun in your house, you are far more likely to accidentally shoot someone or, have that gun accidentally accessed. And it actually increases your chance of being shot owning a gun in your house. So I know that is a hard truth for a lot of gun owners who are like, no, I own this for self protection. It is only effective for self protection if you do all the things that you just laid out, which is be really well trained and understand what you're doing and also secure it safely. So I'd say, like, the number one thing, if you are somebody who just bought a gun because the world feels crazy to you right now and you wanted to have it, I get it. You have to store it safely, right? So it's 3.6 million kids live in homes in this country with unsecure loaded firearms. And when we talk about the fact that gun violence is a leading cause of death for children in the United States, a huge percentage of kids who die from gunshot wounds have accidentally accessed their firearms. So I think if, like, folks do literally nothing else, it's please separate your ammunition from your firearm and please secure it safely. There are gun locks, there are lock boxes, there are a million ways to do it in a cost effective and easy access way. But truly, like, sticking it under your mattress or, putting it in a closet drawer that you think no one will access, is really not okay. Like, even when I was a kid, my father owned a gun and I accidentally, like, stumbled upon it in a closet one day, and it was a long gun. It was a shotgun, or a very traditional shotgun. But I remember, like, going to ask my mom, like, what is this? And she was like, oh my God, like, Dad, you have to move it. So, that is the biggest thing for new gun owners. And, I would just say too, we are past the moment where we can really tell people that they shouldn't be owning guns. It is just not how the country is. It is not, where people are. We're seeing gun ownership increasing among women, among queer Americans, among Black Americans. And it's up to the historical moment that they're in. They feel afraid. And I understand why. So if you're going to take that step and you're going to own the firearm, what we would recommend is taking a training course so that you really understand how to use it and securing it safely. And those are the biggest things.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I think it actually gave me a bit of optimism, and I think it kind of went deeper into this topic beyond what legislation is pending where, and all of the statistics that most of us know anyway. I think getting to the heart of the culture and what we would want to see in a different world was really, really helpful for me. So I want to thank you for that conversation.
Yeah. And thank you for all of your work and the efforts you're making to really educate people on a very important topic. So
So how do people get involved with Giffords?
yeah. Well, so the easiest way would be to go to our website, which is giffords.org. And there are a bunch of things that you can do. You can help us communicate directly with legislators. You can chip in a few dollars. You can join as a volunteer. If you're a gun owner, we'd love to have you join our Gun Owners for Safety program. We've got a bunch of different kinds of coalitions that folks from all different backgrounds can be a part of. And I think that I would just leave people with the note that um, I loved what you said earlier. Hope is not, just a feeling. It's an action. It's things that we do every day. And I know that there are folks who look at this issue and they think to themselves, we've just lost that one, right? Like, so many kids have been killed and we haven't done anything. And the reality is that we have done so much. We have done so much and we can do so much more. And we are making progress even today, even in this climate, in the toughest of locations. And so I think, when we're thinking about this problem, we actually feel a lot of optimism despite all of the loss that we have sustained. And I think the country is, in a similar position where there's a lot of loss that we have sustained. And that optimism, to your earlier point, is the fuel to be able to keep moving forward and be able to show up the way that we need to show up in this historical moment.
Thank you so much. And I hope we get to continue this conversation.
Too. Me too. It was really good to see you.